prices will drop from their peak, and that would wipe out between 4,000 billion and 6,000 billion of household wealth. That number's right. The question is, will they drop 20 or 30%? Further losses from the existing subprime mortgages, which are now estimated at 250 to 300 billion, as you've seen in American institutions are writing down substantial amounts of these losses. But he's suggesting that it could go as high as the estimate of Goldman Sachs, which is 400 billion. It's quite easy to throw around 100 billion here and 100 billion there, but actually it's quite a lot of money. Here in their dollars, it's perhaps worth a little bit less than the baht, a little less. The credit crunch, which spread from mortgages to a wide range of consumer credit. Because if there isn't money around, it can't go into mortgages, won't go anywhere else. The downgrading of the monoline insurers, not implausible. They were just reconfirmed with their ratings, but I don't think anybody really feels how great that decision was. And that could lead to a $150 billion write-down on asset-backed securities, which now depend on the insurers. A meltdown in the commercial property market. A bankruptcy of a large regional or national bank, similar to what happened with the savings and loans in 1989. Big losses on reckless leverage buyouts. That's not impossible anyway, because of the nature of the financing of some of these purchases. A wave of corporate defaults that, according to this theory, would add another 250 billion. A meltdown of the shadow financial system, shown by the stress of hedge funds, special investment vehicles, and made more difficult by the fact that they have no direct access to banks to build them up. A further collapse of stock prices in the market, drying up of liquidity, and then finally a vicious circle of losses, capital reduction, credit contraction, forced liquidation, fire sale of assets at below fundamental prices. I have to say that's a pretty dire view, but it is a view which I give you not because I agree with every step in it, but because the people who are asserting this are not stupid. And Professor Rabin himself is neither, nor is Martin Wolf. And so Elaine and I have come here now to see where we can go in Thailand. We can live quietly in the countryside. So if any of you have any ideas, we'd like to know. But if that 12-step process is anywhere near likely to happen, and I would doubt that it will happen in completeness. In fact, I would bet it won't happen in completeness because there'll be intervention by the authorities. But the truth of the matter is that every one of those assertions in the 12-point plan is at least plausible. And a combination of them is disastrous. I don't think it'll happen, but I do think we're in for a pretty tough year. And I think you'll find that for quite a number of countries and for quite a number of institutions, you will have periods of negative growth, 2 quarters of negative growth, which will talk of recession in this coming 12 months. And one of those could easily be the United States, where the projection of growth has been reduced successively to now close to 1% this year, as distinct from where we started, 3.5%. So I don't think it's a very good moment. But I would say that what I've just read to you is an extreme statement, but not without plausibility in relation to a number of the aspects of it. Yes, please.
Just to follow up on the American issue on this, what I would simply call another example of the excessive money supply coming to the U.S. property market and all that. And this money supply came in via the reserve of, say, Japan, to be accelerated later by the Chinese reserve and all that. Now, basically, this is again, not using that money in your own society and then putting it into the US society, betting on the property market and all that. Some people are saying, which I don't quite understand, and I'm seeking that understanding, that Japan or China should find a way of using that money instead of putting it into the US society and all that. What is your recommendation to it?
Well, the first thing is it's hard to ignore the United States, which has, after all, and the global GDP is about 40 trillion, give or take, 14 or 15 trillion dollars of that economy. China might be $1,000 trillion today. So it's not that the United States becomes negligible, it is still a major economic force. But to get back to your question, the accumulation of reserves today is significantly, not solely, but significantly in terms of the leadership in terms of China and Japan. They rank 1 and 2 in terms of the accumulation of reserves. And together, it's over $2 trillion, or $6 trillion of reserves. Trillion being 1,000 billion dollars. It's a hell of a lot of money. And what many commentators are saying is that putting it into US Treasury securities and things and holding it in money markets is costing them a lot of money. But they're not going to break the market. It has hurt them more to break the United States, and they can't break the United States. The United States, for them, is an integral part of their own development. But what we're seeing is completely new territory. You're finding the Chinese, you're finding the Russians, you're finding other accumulators of these reserves, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, in the last months, putting together very substantial pots of money for investment in the United States, to buy distressed assets, to buy companies, to invest in institutions like Citibank. You know, where did the $19 billion for Citibank come from? Largely from these funds, from these countries. 5 million from Dubai, 4 million from somewhere else. These are not the people that would normally have been expected to be the preferred shareholders of these companies. Approaches to China, approaches to Russia. These are really fantastic moves in terms of economic power. But the economic power is now shifted in terms of available funding. And if you have a sick United States, when I say sick United States, when you have institutions in the United States that have been overly aggressive in terms of leverage and in terms of their financing, to stabilize them, you need funding to come from somewhere. And so the anger at foreign intervention currently is being assuaged because they're coming into minority positions and the money is coming in a very quiet way, but in huge sums of money. So I think this next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years is going to be an extraordinarily interesting time, when the reality of the accumulation of funds is being confronted by the self-image of the OECD countries as being the people that are driving the world, at a time when the economic weight is shifted. It's shifted. And I really thank God I'm retiring. Because I would hate to be there confronting these issues. I think it is unlikely that I will be the next Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm rather glad that that's the case. But I hope whoever it is and who is young and vigorous will understand that the rules that were established in the last 25 years are going to be severely challenged by the realities of the current situation. And I think, quite modestly, that is a correct statement. Sir?
I appreciate your comment on how most people in the economy, based on geographical categorization. If you shift the categories a little, in terms of looking at the upper tiers, the middle class.
I think someone wants you to have a speaker, a microphone. Do you mind repeating the question?
I do appreciate your categorization of the four speed world, basically a geographical and historical growth and size of economy. But if you shift the categorization to looking at the extreme poor, if you can segment them to be the stubborn poor and the relative poor, then look at the middle class, which is vanishing, and the upper tiers. How would you care to see the world in the coming future in the light of the World Bank effort to eliminate some of the poverty in the world, the Millennium Development Goal? Yet you see clearly the disparity that's increasing and the extreme difficulty of eliminating poverty. You see within each country, if you look even more focused in each country, given the powerful emerging countries like India and China that you mentioned, within it there's a tremendous amount of disparity which need to be addressed. Would there be internal explosion? Would there be stability and peace internally, given the whole ideas of income and wealth distribution, which is a problem that we can see clearly everywhere. And even if you look at a bigger picture, when you have this issue of 911, partly it has to do with philosophical understanding of how to deal with different way of living between the prosperity in the West and the people who are not so well off and are the underdog in a world where the globalization game is being set by those who are well off. How could we care to comment on this?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that I think that your assertion that the middle class is declining is not substantiated by the facts. You will have at least 1 billion moving into the middle class in China and India within the course of the next 15 or 20 years. 1 billion people. That's not a trivial number of people. But it doesn't deal with the issue that you're speaking of, which is what happens to the people that are below that level. What happens to the poor in those countries? And what happens to the poor in the countries such as the African, the group 4 that I spoke of, which will grow from 1 billion to 2.5 billion people. That is an issue which I think the governments of India and China, and I'm sad to say almost only in the last 5 years, have really started to confront. In the 16th Central Committee of the Communist Party Congress in 2006, and I quote from it, "Among the current limitations to achieve a harmonious society, the resolution mentions 1. A serious imbalance in the social and economic development between urban and rural areas and across 31 provinces of China." So the first thing that they recognized was that, and as you know, there's a differentiation in incomes of between 4 and 5 times between the wealthiest provinces in China and the least wealthy provinces in China. And the same or similar statistics are certainly there for urban and rural. I think it's around 3.5 times. So you have this distinction within China, which will leave several 100 million people still, if not in absolute poverty under $1 a day, still significantly different, maybe under $2 a day or under $2.50 a day, when you have a much larger middle class. We're going to have to look again at the statistics of poverty, which up to now have been measured by extreme poverty under $1 and less extreme poverty under $2, and so you come up with a number of 3 billion people that are under $2 a day. That's going to have to be replaced by a different measurement. And on that different measurement, you're hitting at something which I think is going to be a core issue for China and for India and for other countries in the Asian region. Maybe not just in the Asian region, but significantly in the Asian region, which is what happens to the rump, what happens to the bit that's left at the bottom. And there, what Hu Jintao is saying is, we've got to get onto that right now. He goes on to talk about the population and environmental problems are worsening. A large portion of the populations find the national situation in employment, social safety nets, income distribution, education, medical care, housing, occupational safety, public order, seriously deficient. I mean, it's just about covered everything that you have in terms of government intervention on life. And a similar thing was said in the ASEAN meetings, the 10th ASEAN ministerial meetings, and the summit that was held in November 2007. The November ASEAN summit talked about energy, environment, climate change, sustainable development, and poverty. There is an awakening now that this issue of poverty, environment, sustainable development cannot be left to the middle class just as the middle class. It's a great thing to have this engine that's coming forward. But if we don't do something to prepare for the people that are left behind, we're going to be in deep trouble in terms of turmoil in our economies and in terms of our societies. Now, I don't know what the answer is, but the one thing that I'm sure of is that finally the issue of poverty is on the agenda. The truth of the matter is that in terms of donations or assistance given by the so-called rich world, it's now running at about $120 billion a year. But when you analyze it in terms, as I've done, in terms of how much reaches poor people, you would be aggressive if you said more than 30 to 40 billion. Aggressive. The rest goes in overheads, the rest goes in losses, the rest goes in cheating, the rest goes in advisory services. The truth of the matter is that maybe it's 30 to 40 billion. And the 30 to 40 billion is not going to the places that need it most. Africa has been stable, in my judgment, for the last 20 years in terms of money. Made a big song and dance about how it's increasing, but it hasn't. So what I'm taking some comfort in is that finally, in addition to Gordon Brown, whom I mentioned before, and the new president of Germany, the new leader of Germany, the president is, actually the president's very good too, it's Horst Kohler, who was my colleague at the Monetary Fund. But Germany is taking an interest in it. So you've got Germany and the UK. You've always had the Scandinavians, the Nordics, who have a serious interest and who are well above the 0.7 in terms of their contribution. If you'll remember, the world agreed that the rich world would give 0.7% of their income for development expenditures. The United States is about 0.15 at this moment. So finally, it looks as though people are starting to wake up to the fact that this is a critical issue. But I ask you to look at the current presidential debates. Last year, I asked Jim Lehrer, who was an American television commentator, and who was doing the debates between the two candidates, if he would ask a question on development. Because I said, Jim, there's never been a question on poverty and development. And these are presidential candidates. It took exactly 90 seconds for him to ask it and to be answered. And he swore that he would never ask another question on poverty and development. Because in the United States, and it includes in this debate, you haven't heard a word from either Hillary Clinton or from... You had a reference by Obama to it because of his history. But it's not a political issue. It will not win you an election in the United States. In fact, the more you talk about it, the less likely you are to have support. So what troubles me greatly, and it's not just in the UK, it is that this $120 billion figure, which everybody talks about, is not a real figure. It is not, there is no real recognition on the part of the rich world that they are interdependent with the developing world. And in any event, the time frame within which both poverty and environment is going to impact them is well beyond the immediate political cycle. It's not going to be in the 4 years or 5 years or 2 years that people are elected for. And the result is that you get domestic issues dealt with. But the truth is that the world is becoming more and more interdependent. And this is not just said by me because I was active in that field and had to say it, but it's manifestly true. And the issues of interdependence and the issue of global stability cannot be dealt with on a whim from week to week. This is something that takes decades to deal with. Decades. And it requires education. It requires education of all our young people to understand the difference in the world. People of my generation, it's too late. But we have to do something with the next generation. And I regard this as a hugely important subject, and I think I'm probably running out of time. Okay?
Gentleman over here, sir.
Here in UTCC, and I recently learned in my macroeconomics class about fiat currency.
About what?
Fiat currency? Fiat currency? Is that how you say it?
You can tell me about it.
Yeah. So I'm not too sure about it. Basically, I've learned that it's not based on gold, but it's based on like fake money or something. It's like based on debt.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently learned about it. So banks lend money not on full reserve system, but on a fractional reserve system. This is all new to me, so I'm quite worried about it. So the money I get paid with, the money I borrow from a bank, is not actually real gold. It's paper money made out of thin air or something. And when I heard about this, I was quite worried. So I was thinking, is this true? Is it true that central banks like in England and in the Federal Reserve pump out this fake paper money? Or
Well, you're seeing now this paper money, which is the dollar at the moment, shifting more than 25% in its value against other currencies in the last several years. It's lost 25% of its value. And the truth of the matter is that there has always been a differentiation in the strength of currencies based on domestic activities and their international ramifications in terms of trade and in terms of investment. What you're seeing today is that the leading economy in the world, which has been the United States, is subject to internal excesses which make other people think that the dollar doesn't have the value that it once did. In the year 2000, the debt of the US government was $6 trillion, it's now $9 trillion in the space of 8 years. That makes the value of the dollar, given that that's a debt of the United States that prints these things, quite worrying. And when you then look also at the strength of the financial institutions in the way that I described them earlier, you have to say that the United States at the moment is having a lot of problems. Now, if that happens, people tend to run away from the dollar into something else. And so they're running more into the euro, and they're running, as you can see, perceptibly into gold. Because the gold price is now, whatever it is, $1,000 an ounce or something enormous. And a lot of people thinking it'll double. So I would say to you that, you have reason to be concerned, and what most people are doing.
How should I protect myself in the future if say the dollar does completely drop?
Sorry?
What should I do? What's your opinion? How should I protect myself as like an average person?
If you're a rich person, I would probably buy some euros and gold and find a rich girlfriend.
Could I ask the next question, please? Since my hand up on phone.
Okay, sir.
I'm David Steen. Sir, thank you for your brilliant exposition of the problems. As an aside, can I suggest, as a Thai resident, that you try Chiang Mai province?
Thank you very much.
My question is, having given this changing world scenario, what are the inferences in changes to the World Bank and the other UN agencies in their role and function? How could such changes be achieved, and could they ever be achieved in time? Having been an ex-UN employee, I know the problems of such change and the time scale, but I very much appreciate your comments.
I think that it's quite obvious that there are whole segments of developing countries which no longer need the financial support of the World Bank or UN agencies. But what they still need is some technical help, and that's what's happening on education, on healthcare, on the passing on of information of what worked in one country and what didn't work, and that is still alive and well at the World Bank. And I can speak of the World Bank more than I can speak about the UN system, although I believe it to be true of UNDP and some of the UN agencies which are now being run by ex-World Bankers, as you probably know. But the more significant thing is, I think, that Bob Zellick, who is now running the World Bank, is very clearly signaling that the weight of lending from the World Bank now must be focused on Africa and the poor countries. It has to be. And I think that what Bob is doing now is preparing the place and preparing the shareholders for an understanding that Africa is front and center. And he's just been round to get the IDA replenishment, which is the International Development Agency replenishment, which is for soft loans, if you like, to these countries, and was successful not only in achieving its target, but exceeding its target. So I think that you have the right leadership of the World Bank now in Bob Zellick. I think there is a willingness and a necessity to change. I mean, there is just no point in waiting around to lend to China. It's just preposterous, and the same is true in terms of India. On the other hand, there are still a number of things that the Chinese would like to have from the World Bank in terms of knowledge. The same is true of India. If you get to Bangladesh and Myanmar and a few other places in Asia, they still need the money from the World Bank. But it's a much smaller proportion, and so they, along with African countries, become the target, I think, that the World Bank needs to have and should have. And after all, there's still going to be 2.5 or 3 billion people there'll still be a third of the world in 2050. So it's not a trivial number.
Thank you, Mr. Wolfensohn, for a wonderful presentation on the 4-speed world. My question is more fundamental. Maybe to an extent I'm going to pinch a few words from what you just stated. I'm talking about basically the fundamental issues like poverty. Let's say in poverty it leads to social issues, leads to health, it leads to hate. You did touch upon all that. I'd like to understand from you. On the one hand, we have issues of drug licensing and so on and so forth. And the crude price, the gold price, everything hitting the roof and going bust. With this kind of scenario, what kind of interventions are required to ensure, if you look at the oil companies, the pharma companies, hand over fist money is being made. But the poor guys on the street is struggling to get even cancer drugs and so on, which is pathetic state in most parts of Asia. So are there some controls possible to even out this disparity, primarily rising out of economic disparity? Would World Bank and some of these agencies do something? Because these are ground realities. You did touch upon education, yes, wonderful. But that's going to take decades to really catch up because you need to start from the grassroots. I'm not at the same time saying you haven't done enough work, but the speed is inadequate, is my feeling. Thank you.
Well, I think that it's not going to be very effective to tell the oil producers to reduce the price from $100 to $50 or $25. They're not going to do it, and they control the resource. So I wouldn't start with the oil price. But I would do one thing, and that is if I were, and we're seeing signs of it now with the leadership of China and India. And if you talk to Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh, they're saying exactly what I was about to say. Is that the solution is in China and India. It's not in the US or in Canada or in Norwegian countries. Unless you get a different ethic and a different sense of responsibility in China and India, you're not going to solve the problems. No outsider will solve the poverty problem in India. My wife and I have been through hundreds of slums and places throughout India. We spent weeks there. And it's the local initiatives which will solve it. It's not an intervention by the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or some rich American coming along. These are national challenges. And what troubles me in China and India 10 years ago was that it wasn't politically popular and there were not very many leaders who were prepared to say that. It does seem to me now that there are some. And given the potential of China and India in terms of its total GDP, by 2050 of being the first and the third economies in the world, they ought to start now thinking about what they're going to do with the resources. And the resources don't all have to go to major companies and major entrepreneurs. And the time to think of it is now, as is the time for education and healthcare. It's just not enough to say that it takes time to change education. Of course it does. It's a decade and maybe longer. But you have to start. And, I think that the leadership in Chidambaram's latest budget, if you saw that, I don't know whether you're from India, but if you saw Chidambaram's latest budget, which came out yesterday, they're talking about forgiveness of debt for the poorest people, but a 20% increase in the education budget, and a small increase in the health budget. I think the health budget's too low, by the way, in terms of India. But the fact that they're prepared, the number one item on his agenda was education, is I think just exactly what it should be. So I think you're starting to get enlightened leadership. I just wish it had been there a few more years ago.
In recent days, Gaza has once again been seized with violence. Given your experience there during the disengagement process, what do you see as the way forward? What's the next best step?
Well, I think that we need to see a continuation of the discussions between the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership in the way that it is now progressing. And I think you are seeing, obviously, the greater interest being taken by President Bush and the Secretary of State, both with his recent visit to the Middle East and his projected visit in May. The objective which the United States has, and hopefully they may be able to achieve, is that with Ehud Olmert as the Prime Minister of Israel and Abu Mazen as the leader of the West Bank faction of the Palestinians, they may be able to get an agreement which would then encompass Gaza as well, and that would lead to a solution. But the sort of thing that's happened in the last couple of days is an example of the tensions on both sides. You're not going to have rocket attacks from Gaza on suburbs in Israel. And when they happen, you're going to have an overreaction to go back in. Because you can't send rockets back in and hit the people that are perpetrating it, unfortunately. And when that happens and 35 people are killed, it's not surprising that Abu Mazen says, let's stop the negotiations, at least temporarily. I don't know what's going to happen. I spent a lot of time there, and I'm just back from a trip to other parts of the Middle East. And there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of frustration. But there's a lot of individual egos on the line in both sides. And I'm not sure that people will rush to get a settlement in before Bush departs. If there is a new president going to come in who will be responsible to make sure the thing works. So I have some doubt myself as to whether it will happen in this year. Although I very much hope, and so many Palestinians and Israelis, that a framework will be established and agreed upon, which will include an approach to borders and an approach to Jerusalem, and an approach to return, all three of which are essential, but which are very, very difficult issues. And probably in the end will not be agreed upon until you have a whole package where one side, where you've got a package and you say, I'm going to take this pay and you get this benefit, I'm going to take this pay and this benefit. What you're not going to have is a serial series of negotiations until you have a complete package on both sides where you can say, great, I'll take that. And that's, I think, the great flaw in what is happening now. What is needed is a complete solution. And I personally don't think it'll happen seriatim. I think it'll happen one thing after another. I think everything is linked with everything else. And as you know, the Palestinians want to start with Jerusalem and the Israelis want to finish with Jerusalem. So there is some difficulty. What I do understand is that Abu Mazen and Ehud Olmert seem to be getting along pretty well until a few days ago. When something like this happens, it's undoubted that you will have a cessation of negotiations. I think, Mr. President, before everybody leaves, shouldn't we call this to a halt?
Yeah, may I allow me the last question from the distinguished guest over here?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sure you're tired, but...
I'm not tired. I just think you must be tired.
I'd like to raise this issue of global governance. But before doing so, I'd like to thank you for your speech, for the good story of Asia. We appreciate that very much. In fact, I experienced this good story of Asia when I was attending the World Bank IMF meeting last October in Washington, D.C. I felt that people were so friendly to me, wanted to talk to me. But very often they asked me, are you from China? When I said I'm from Thailand, they slowly walked away. So it's obvious that Asia to them meant China rather than Thailand. But never mind. On this issue of global governance, you haven't discussed it very much, but I'm sure you're very well aware of it. As all of us know, formally we had this global governance very much dictated or given to us by the Bretton Woods institutions, one of which you were involved with. Now, with the so-called second speed countries influence coming up, and obviously they are exercising their influence. You talk about China in Africa, you can see China also in Laos, in Cambodia, and so on. So, what is your scenario of this global governance when the institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions are somewhat declining in terms of their influence? And when these countries are taking their place, we used to be familiar with democratization, liberalization, privatization, and all this from Bretton Woods institutions. But next 10 years, 15 years, please tell us your view, your scenario on global governance. Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, starting at the top, the G7 needs to be the G10 or the G15. And I think that that is inevitable and is already happening with an expansion of the G7. It's lunacy to have a small European country in the G7 when China and India are not. It's just silly. And I think that's what President Lula was saying at the meeting that I'm describing, and I think that is generally accepted. So you'll see change at the top level. Maybe the club will stay together and they'll meet separate days, I don't know. But certainly that would. And the second thing is that there is already a move in the World Bank and in the fund to change the voting. I tried very hard, but it was impossible. There was a minor change made in the last couple of years to expand the voting rights of China, but there needs to be a complete revamping of it. But if that happens, then there needs to be a complete revamping of the capital contributions. of these countries and a willingness to stand behind the bank. Now, that is now much more possible than it was 5 years ago, because the reserves of these countries that need greater representation are now able that they can, in fact, substantiate their capital contribution and the call on capital that would be required, which would not have been perhaps as creditworthy years ago. So I think you will see that happening. The third thing that is clearly happening, even when I was running the bank, is that developing countries generally, and in particular China and India, but not limited to them, speak out a hell of a lot more on what is going on at the institution. They have bigger offices, they have better people, they are better prepared. And it's not just at the bank. I hear this from my friends in a number of the international agencies. That some of the best people now representing governments come from the emerging powers in the developing world. I think it started and it's irrevocable. It is impossible in a world with so many changes, like I just described, in relation to the credit markets in the United States, with borrowings from Arab countries and China and India and God knows what, that you can run the world in the way you did when you had all the control over the purse strings. It's just very clear that it has to change. And I think there is a lot of evidence today that it will change. And I think the construction of the international institutions that you described, that there'll be a lot of bargaining and there'll be a lot of toing and froing, but I don't think anybody has any doubt that these institutions must change or they'll be irrelevant. There'll be new institutions we set up. And I don't think anybody wants that, so I think there's a very good chance that you'll have a restructuring of these institutions. And it won't be tomorrow, it'll be over a period of years.
Thank you. I know the last chance is finished, but yes, from here. I'm from the Chinese embassy.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I don't have a specific question to ask, but since you have talked so much about China, I just want to thank you for your attention you gave to my country. And
I'm actually Chinese.
And in addition to your address, I would like to put some comment on that. In connection with the environmental issue you mentioned about China, and thank you for so much data, which I just hear it for the first time. And I want to add something about the attitude of Chinese government. As is known, Chinese government now is adopting a scientific development policy. And that means our government pays much more attention to the environmental issue. And they are not only speaking about it, they are actually doing something about it. Here I can give you some of the examples. Like we are shutting down the factories which overpopulated the environment, and now we are considering to cancel the use of plastic bags. And in our weather forecast, we even predict the degree of the sky clearance every day. I think it's unique in the world. No country has such attached so much great importance to the clearance of the sky. So that's what I want to let you know. But still, we need to development. As you have mentioned, we still have so many people under the poverty line. So I think China should be allowed to address the environmental issue in a step-by-step manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I have a tremendous regard for what the Chinese government is now doing, and I quoted from your last 16th plan, and I think they're very serious about it. And I think on the views of the people themselves, the people very much have expressed their views prior to that Congress. But the truth of the matter is you have a huge problem. And if you go to the Beijing Olympics, you will see the problem when you get there. I've recently been to Beijing, and it's not an easy city. And in the case of India, they're opening a coal-fired power plant every week, which just gives you an idea of what India is doing. I'm not suggesting that it's hopeless. I don't think it is. but the increase in utilization of power in your country and the development will lead to greater environmental damage, both in terms of water, and in terms of environment, and in terms of other things. And I think your government is conscious of it, but the pace of your economic growth is such that it's going to be a very difficult thing for them to deal with. But given that in the last 5-year plan, the two issues that they talked about were inequality and environment as the first two items in the 5-year plan, gives me hope that that's what they believe. And it must be something that's popular because it was done at the party congress. So I look forward to coming back in 40 or 50 years' time and seeing what you've done. Thank you very much.
So on behalf of the organizer, I would like to express my sincere thanks for such a remarkable and challenging speech in dialogue. We see that although he is retired, he still has drawn us to our attention about the importance of bridging all gaps occurring around the clock, like the name of his speech, North, East, South, and West. The issues like economic environments, poverty, inequality facing many countries in Asia. And only bridging all these together to be smaller, global peace and stability will occur. So this is really a very challenging issue. And we will look to, thank you. Okay, and after this, ladies and gentlemen, we have the refreshment out there for you to relax, and you can take this opportunity to have a word or ask some more questions from Mr. Wolfensohn. Thank you very much, and we hope that you enjoy this speech and probably come back again later in the future when we have the great event. For our distinguished guests, we would like you to and Your Excellencies, please come to the podium. We'd like to have the group picture in the front. A group picture, please.
I think we should make a social work connection with the IMF.